Shalom, Erev Tov, good evening from Jerusalem, Israel. This is Lowell Joseph Gallen, founder of the Root and Branch Association Limited, established in New York State in God of Israel Bless America in 1981, and now celebrating our 40th anniversary. I would like to welcome our viewers and listeners worldwide and our live Zoom studio audience to this evening's program in our Root and Branch Association Limited English Language Conference and Lecture Series broadcasting from Jerusalem, Israel, and now celebrating the start of our second quarter century, our second 25 years. As I always do at the beginning of each program, I thank the wonderful institution and people there who hosted our first 25 years, from January 1995 until December 2020. The Orthodox Union of America, its Israel Center at 22 Keren Hayesod Street in Jerusalem, and its educational director emeritus and founder and editor-in-chief emeritus of its remarkable Torah Tidbits publication, Mr. Phil Chernovsky, his Eshet Chayil, woman of valor, Mrs. Tony Chernovsky, and the long-suffering Mrs. Itter Rachel Russick, the scheduler, who kept the whole place going like Grand Central Station with trains in and out. I don't know how she did it. I would have been carried out on a stretcher a long time ago. Thank you to you all. Because of that start then, we can go ahead now on Zoom. Everything's been closed for a year, up until about 2 weeks ago. So here we are. I'm broadcasting from my kitchen. Today is Tuesday, June 15th, 2021 in the Gregorian calendar, and the 5th day of Tammuz 5781 in the Hebrew Israel calendar. As we always like to do, we like to note events in history that took place around this time that should be remembered. On May 19th, 1943, the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, Jewish uprising against the Nazis, came to an end. On June 5th, 1967, the miraculous Six-Day War began. And on June 6th, 1944, American, British, and Canadian and Allied troops landed at Normandy, at the Omaha Beach and other beaches in Normandy, and began the liberation of France from Nazi Germany. Because of them, we are here today. They should be remembered. We are broadcasting from the land of Israel, city of God, Jerusalem, hill of the priests, Givat Hanania Abu Tur, overlooking Mount Moriah, where we believe that the third and final Israelite temple of Jerusalem will soon be under reconstruction and stand forever, as per the prophet Ezekiel's vision. Please see the biblical book of Ezekiel, chapters 40 through 48. The Root and Branch Association promotes faith in the God of Israel who created us all, for the nations to honor and observe his Noahide covenant and laws, and for all to honor God's land, Torah, and people covenants with his chosen people, Israel. And by Israel, we mean all 12 tribes, 10 of whom will be returning shortly. So that is what we are about. I now also dedicate each program in honor and memory of my father, Lieutenant Colonel Martin Gallen, who was buried on October 16th, 2018, with a full honor guard, with full military honors in Westchester County. His body returned to the earth, his soul went to heaven. ROTC, City College in the 1930s, entered World War II as lieutenant on the European theater, exited World War II as a captain, retired in the reserves as a lieutenant colonel. That meant a great deal to him. He is here with us tonight as well. And in terms of prophetic time, I believe that we are on day 93 of the second year of the renewing Fifth Israelite monarchy, which for reasons I will not go into right now, but I have discussed it with Tamar Yon in a program, began on Rosh Chodesh Nisan 1 year and 3 months ago. Please see the prophet Daniel chapter 2, verse 44. Regarding the Noahide covenant and laws, please see Genesis chapter 9. If you are a Christian, please see the book of Acts 15. And now, our speaker for this evening's program is medical doctor, and Army officer Robert Katz, who will be speaking on Jewish identity. He will be introduced by my long-term friend and colleague, Dr. Les Glassman, our program chair, a dentist. If you need a crown or a root canal, come over to Jerusalem and see Les. We also welcome the host of our monthly Greek Jewish history seminar, Professor Asher Matatias, Zorba the Jew, who has become a regular panelist on our regularly scheduled programming. And now I'm going to give the floor to Les, who's going to introduce Dr. Katz.
Thank you so much, Lowell, and it's a great honor and a privilege to introduce our esteemed speaker this evening, Dr. Katz. So I'm just going to give a brief bio. You initially worked in the security field, you were injured, and you became a medical doctor, and then you became the owner of a multidisciplinary healthcare practice. I think that you were born actually in Boston, in the Boston area, and as a result of 9/11, which you all remember so distinctly, you used your military and your intel contacts to help found the National Intelligence Conference and then the Intelligence Summit. Now you run the American Resurgence. 3 sons that you have grew up in the inner city of Boston. Now, Dr. Katz, our esteemed speaker for this evening, is the winner of numerous awards from the Federation of the Jewish Men's Clubs, Man of the Year in 2003. I think they should update this, and maybe next year as well, in the following years. And President at various Shura. Long-time donor to numerous Jewish charities and political organizations, and 12-year veteran of the American military. I think most important is you have a nephew in Golani and a niece in the military intel in the IDF, and that makes us all so much safer. So with any further ado, I want to call on our esteemed speaker, Dr. Katz.
Well, the first thing I would like to say is that I'm probably the Forrest Gump of Jewish history. A number of the things that Lowell mentioned, my family had an involvement. For instance, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising ended on May 19th, 1943, but to the best of my knowledge, it started on April 19th, 1943, and that is when my parents were married. I always remember, we would always remember that part of the Jewish identity that I'm speaking about is we would always reference that at our Passover Seders, because April 19th, 1943, to the best of my knowledge, I was not there, was the beginning of Passover, the first night of Pesach, the first Seder. So that is one touchstone point of Jewish history and identity. As far as June 6, 1944, my Uncle Jackie, was landed on that beach at Omaha Beach, come from a military family. And my other uncle, Uncle Arnold, unless you remember these things, they all fall into the dustbin of history, so I believe it to be important. My Uncle Arnold was in a support function at the Battle of Midway. My father only had one eye, so he could only work in the naval shipyard. One of probably the greatest regrets of his life was not being in the American military, which I tried to rectify. As far as June 5th, 1967 goes, I was in high school at the time and remember interacting with an Arab fellow who basically said all kinds of slurs and invective against the Jewish people and that they needed to be destroyed. And that's what he was hoping for. And I politely and cordially invited him outside so I could kick his keister, so to speak. He respectfully, after that point, respectfully declined. And it taught me something which is inherent in the whole concept of Jewish history, which is unless you stand up for yourself, unless you stand up for your identity, unless you are proud of who you are, then you are subject to bullying by any and everyone. And Israel as a nation has done that on a national level. Jews as a people have not done that on a personal level. So progress has been made in that regard vis-a-vis Jewish identity, but until the individual Jew is, I won't say feared, but I will say respected, then we will get more of the same of the last 2,000 years of oppression. Wonderful to have an army, good to have the national draft, but on a personal level, you have to be ready for negative circumstances. So that was a mouthful, and I can answer most anything you wish to ask.
Okay, Doc, can I just mention something quite interesting? It's a phenomenal fact of history that it took the Germans, it took them longer to destroy the ghetto, the Warsaw Ghetto, than to conquer the whole of Poland, which is actually quite unbelievable. It's a phenomenal part of world history and Jewish history in particular, that the whole German army, they took them longer to destroy, the Warsaw Ghetto with so few, with Jews with such limited, ammunition or whatever they had, than to capture the whole of Poland. It's just unbelievable.
It is downright, just as the state of Israel is miraculous, that was perhaps a miracle equal to that. Yes, the German Nazi commander, the Blitzkrieg Panzer tank unit heading that up was Colonel Jürgen Strupp. I happen to know that because I used to lecture throughout the country on the Jewish military resistance, of which my family was a part. Most notably, my relative Rachel Reibstein, who worked with Rosa Robata in blowing up the crematoria at Auschwitz. That didn't end well for them, but the bravery and courage shown by the Jewish partisans, so like I say, of which my family was a part, is another part of Jewish history, Jewish identity, which is a great source of pride. And yes, Jürgen Strupp had the famous quotation, which is to say, God help us if the Jew ever becomes armed and has a weapon. There will be a force to be reckoned with. That's paraphrasing. That was his exact quote. And quite frankly, his exact quote was in German. So there you go.
Coincidentally, the Greek Jews also rose up, blew up one of the crematoria there.
Thessaloniki, the Jews of Thessaloniki, Salonika were great Jews. They worked as stevedores in the ports and whatnot. In fact, a great movie, again, that references Jewish identity. An Amazing Man was the Greek middleweight Balkan champion. I used to do a little boxing because I had to, because every ethnic group on the face of the planet wanted to rearrange my face. I think I'm still pretty. Or at least my wife does, and I guess that's all that really matters. But and that was Salomo, the professor will know him, Salomo Aruch, who was featured in Triumph of the Spirit, played by Willem Dafoe, a fine movie, a harrowing movie about concentration camp people, prisoners fighting for the pleasure of the Gestapo and fighting to the death, in fact. So
even under desperate circumstances, it gives the lie to those who insist that Jews went to the gallows voluntarily to the slaughterhouse. They resisted with whatever necessary.
There was a lot of resistance, and that again is another part of Jewish history, which then fuses into Jewish identity. Who wants to identify with the perennial victim? Poor, poor, pitiful me. But if you can identify with a positive Jewish pride, with positive identity, take pride in such amazing, miraculous acts of heroism, not in a militaristic sense, but in a self-defense. I was forced into a corner and did the right thing in protecting my family and my people. So yes. But yes, and that was one of my favorite lectures, and it's an unfortunate point of fact that I didn't really get the support from the Jewish community that one would expect. I would contact synagogues, it shows up, contact everyone. And yes, I spoke quite a bit on the subject, but I would have thought that it would have set, I even contacted Steven Spielberg to do a movie about it. He, to his credit, he did do something that was in the ballpark, and that movie was called Defiance, with the James Bond fellow, that Daniel Craig, and that was a fine movie, but it is source of a great many movies, I would think. But that is one of the few that was done. Also Escape from Sobibor. So with that, I'm happy to take further questions or elaborate on most anything.
Okay, and Robert, can I just ask, are you, do you give lectures at different universities or different high schools? You still...
I haven't been as active in that as I was. I was doing a lot of that in the early 2000s. Of late, I have not done that many lectures. Probably in the last 10 years, I have not done that many, but before that time, I gave to the universities. I would lecture on the Middle Eastern politics, which would, you know, as you can well imagine, get heated sometimes, which was enjoyable, because at the end of the day, and this will also tie into the topic of Jewish identity, at the end of the day, I would say what I had to say. And it was controversial in the sense of I would simply speak the truth unapologetically. And for the crowd not to see a meek, appeasing, apologetic Jew was set their minds on fire. And I have to tell you, sometimes walking out to the parking lot was a bit of a chore. I remember one time being surrounded by a bunch of Arab attendees to my talk who insisted that I back down from some of the things I had to say. By the way, everything I had to say is not the least bit, shall we say, racist or bigoted. It simply tells the truth. And I would not back down, and they did not appreciate that. But they also appreciate the fact that what they were so much wanting to do to me, I could reply in return, shall we say.
Can I ask you a question, Robert, because I'll need to go at 8, unfortunately, but something which is very, very worrying and concerning that happened here during the latest skirmishes or the war with Gaza, when over 4,000 rockets, say 4,300 rockets were fired at civilians in Israel, and we retaliated. So there were over 100 American, came from the Reform and the Conservative, and maybe Reconstructionists, rabbis and cantorial students, that they wrote an open letter condemning Israel, the IDF, the Israeli army, as practicing like war crimes.
Let me cut you short, sir. Let me cut you short. That is absolutely treasonous, traitorous, and disgusting. There is no other way to put it.
So can I just ask you, because in Israel, it was so hurtful that at this time when, you know, civilians were being targeted and being killed, and Jewish and Arab, Muslim, Christian made no difference. It was against civilians. You have future leaders of Jewish communities in America, progressive or whatever, condemning Israel of practicing apartheid and crimes against humanity. How does one combat that? How does one, because the problem with that isn't really the 100. The problem is that they are going to be the leaders of their communities. And if they feel that the IDF is committing these war crimes because we're retaliating, how do we deal with such a, this is an immense new problem that it's very hard to comprehend.
Okay, there is no one size fits all panacea. All I can tell you to that is I've spent my life doing just that. As one man, the power of one, railing against that sort of thing. You say that you use the term Jewish leaders. I would put leaders in quotation marks. These are the opposite of leaders. They have, in a sense, taken over. They always dominated Jewish quote unquote leadership, but they have now since taken over. I have offered many times to lecture for them, consult with them, work with them, whatever. No takers, really. They're not interested. You call it progressive, I call it what it is, I call it regressive. They think of themselves as also morally superior. I like to deflate their balloon. This is why the future of American Jewry is not bright, I would have to say, other than the fact that there is an ever increasing percentage of Orthodox Jewish, religious Jews and Chabad and whatnot, increasing, but the reform and conservative movements will fall by the wayside because they do not understand Jewish identity, because they kowtow to their peers, because they seek their approval. We have a stamp man here, a philatelist here.
Yeah.
Well, the Jews of America are constantly seeking the stamp of approval of everyone else. And I used to live in the South. I lived in New Orleans, Louisiana. I was very popular in the South. I was the only Jew around. Why was I popular in the South? They called me Super Jew or King of the Jews. Why? Because I was unapologetically Jewish. Just like in the Republican Party, they have rhinos, Republicans in name only. The conservative and reform Jews you speak about, Dr. Glassman, are ginos, Jews in name only. I commonly associate with them if they dare challenge me, and I deflate their balloon verbally and intellectually. Thankfully, I don't have to do that physically with other ethnic groups. It sometimes does get to that. I'm getting a bit long in the tooth for that and have fractures throughout my teeth from that, but if need be, I can do what is necessary. And in fact, that's not machismo or bravado. If you're going to speak the truth, then you have to be ready for that. And that's why I always advocate. There's another form and part of Jewish identity that every Jew be well-versed in weapons and in Krav Maga, that sort of thing, self-defense techniques. Because otherwise, you're just whistling Dixie, you're just hoping and praying that nothing bad happens, and you are fearful of speaking out and speaking your mind because of the repercussions of so doing.
I'll just mention there's a Rabbi Amiel Hirsch. I don't know if you've heard of him. He's in the Stephen Weiss show in New York.
I'm sorry, Rabbi what?
Amiel Hirsch. So he wrote an amazing article that appeared in the Jerusalem Post, and it was very courageous of him because he actually did fight in the IDF. He volunteered and he was officer. And he said when the Jews, and he said his movement, when you detach from peoplehood, when you detach from the state of Israel, he said it's going to fail and it's going to fracture. And he doesn't see a bright future for the movement, the reform movement, if they detach from peoplehood and from the state of Israel. And I think it was a very courageous article that he wrote. I actually wrote to him to commend him because he feels very strongly the Zionist connection. And he's very, very upset about what's happening a lot in the, in the reform movement, where there've been many organizations that are attacking Israel and become extremely anti-Israel. And it's very hurtful. But his article was phenomenal, and it's actually coming from somebody who's quite high up. So let's hope that more people will listen to what he has to say. But it was actually quite heartwarming that somebody took the courageous step to point out that when you detach from peoplehood and from the state of Israel, your connection, then he sees no future for the movement, which I think was quite amazing.
Yes, well, I would never minimize courage such as that, but I don't even consider it courage. I just consider it reality. It's just referencing reality. The reform and to an ever-increasing degree, the conservative movement will not survive. I've been doing this a long time. As I mentioned, my christening, so to speak, if I may use the term.
Baptismal.
Well, let's not go that far. My christening was, as I say, in 1967. I was 15 at the time. I had been, and ended up raising funds for emergency Israeli needs and whatnot. But I've been doing this a long time, and I have to say the only quote that comes to mind is Rudyard Kipling. And that quote is, "And now the herd is lost in darkness, and I bless them as I leave." What do I mean by that? I spent many years trying to, shall we say, show the light to reform conservative types. It was like planting seeds on barren land, on the sidewalk, if you will. I do believe in the concept of the saving remnant of Jews, Jews who are Jewish Jews will save the Jewish people. Reform and conservative Jews, in many cases, will assimilate and fall by the wayside. And this is of course unfortunate. I would love for it to be different, but until there is a major sea change in the concept of what Jewish identity is and what it's about and what it can mean for you individually, not just as a people, for a nation, but individually. You cannot advance, evolve to what you can be unless you can understand your roots and branches and where you came from. So that is my position and has been for a very long time.
Thank you. Prof, if you want to make any comments, or Lowell, if you'd like to say any comments.
Well, I would like to ask Dr. Katz, what area of medicine do you practice? Are you a general practitioner?
That is actually a point I needed to clear up. Thank you for referencing that. I was a chiropractor, okay? And so let me tell you
Chiropractor.
Yes, so I had a multidisciplinary healthcare practice. I was a chiropractor. My wife is a medical doctor, Stanford professor, and we're both still in the Army. She a colonel, I a staff sergeant. I like to be on the non-commissioned officer side because they get out and do the dirty work, so to speak. She likes the officer status. So not an officer, but an NCO, non-commissioned officer. And so we had a multidisciplinary healthcare practice with MDs and physical therapists and whatnot. So that answers that question. The fun part of that, I can say it now, is back when I was working in security in the Middle East and whatnot, I was hit by a car while I was on a bicycle when I was in Israel. And I commonly like to say, I've never been able to determine if it was just a bad Israeli driver or an assassination attempt on what I was doing. But it sounds a lot cooler if you say assassination attempt. So I'm just going to go with it, if I may.
The last couple of days. Oh, go ahead.
Ashley, just one other question. And Dr. Katz, where in California do you live and practice?
Well, I generally like to be vague about that because based upon some of the things I've done, I do get my share of death threats. So
Okay.
let's just call
California.
Let's just call it Northern California, shall we?
Okay.
I never thought, by the way, I never in my wildest dreams thought I would end up in Northern California, but life is funny like that. You know, why does anyone do what they do? And the obvious answer to that question is because of a woman.
Yeah.
And my wife wanted to move out here and be with the rest of her family in this area in Northern California. So much to my amazement, dismay, and horror, I have been in Northern California on the left coast for quite some time.
Could you tell us something about the American resurgence?
America Resurgent.
America
Yes.
Resurgent that you're the founder of, I believe.
Yes, America, and I haven't updated the website. I've been a tad busy. I have a new grandchild who I'm hoping to show to you before this program ends.
You're 39 years old. You're a grandfather? Get out of here.
Yeah, it just happened. May I call him in now?
Oh, please, it's.
I mean, because that will make the entire show.
Okay.
Absolutely.
I mean, you don't want to hear about me prattle on and on. If you can see my grandson. Elijah? Can Elijah come in a moment?
Elijah.
So you want to build the third temple, so you need Eliyahu. You need Eliyahu Hanavi, right?
Right.
So I took it as part of my mission statement to bring you Eliyahu Hanavi. So hopefully he's not sleeping. If he is, well, that takes precedence over everything. But
I think we all grandparents here. All of us have got a grandchild.
So,
Yeah.
we have 7.
7 grandchildren. Oh, you are indeed blessed.
I have one, but he's so special at the moment, and we just It's the best club in the world, being a grandparent. The best club. There's no club like it.
Yeah.
Well, since you mentioned that, we just had number 3, 14 days ago. Our
Yeah.
third Israelite warrior princess is now 14 days young.
Oh,
It was a
wonderful.
home birth. I was not in favor of that, but I wasn't asked. And everything's fine with home births except when they're not fine. Fortunately, it was fine, and the baby
Yes.
seems to be doing okay. So now over here are our 2 girls, and the older one now has 3 girls of her own. So there's a lot of Israelite warrior princesses right here in our family.
Oh, that's
Yeah.
wonderful. That's wonderful. Well, that is indeed the future. So there you go.
Now, could you tell us about America Resurgent?
Ah, yes, America Resurgent. Ah,
This is
yes.
my-
Minor issue
my-
compared to my grandson, but I will delve into that. So I after 9/11, I was involved. I was the program director for something called the National Intelligence Conference. It had a nickname called IntelCon, but I never liked that name. And we were it was basically an attempt to bring together high-ranking military and intelligence. This is actually somewhat interesting. Back then, I had the feeling, much borne out in the ensuing 20 years, that the American military and intel, and the Israeli military as well, was experiencing a leftward drift, shall we say, in their worldview. And I thought that to be perhaps one of the most dangerous things in the world, because if you have a leftward thinking viewpoint, both in the Israeli military or American military and intelligence communities, then it is over. It is all over. So that's why I was the program director for the National Intelligence Conference to get the various, at the time, 16 American agencies together on the same page as a result of 9/11. And then I partnered with John Loftus, who Lowell, of course, is close to and knows. And we did a spin-off from that called the Intelligence Summit, again, with the same concept in mind in my mind, to combat the leftward drift of predominantly American military and intel. But we would always have, I would always invite some of my Israeli folks to speak, such as, I won't mention his name, but the operations director of Mossad at the time, and also Bogi Yalon and General Cooper Vasa, and a number of others. So it was, and it was a wonderful thing, because my famous line was, the most pro-American thing you can do is be pro-Israeli. And for that matter, the converse is true. The most pro-Israeli thing you can be is pro-American. But the common line I was known for was the first. So that was the Intelligence Summit, and co-founded that with John Loftus, who some of you may or may not know was a Department of Justice Nazi war crimes investigator and prosecutor. So he was close to my heart, my family having been involved with the Jewish partisans. So, and then the Barack Obama administration came in, and I'm not quite as foolish as I look, and I felt that would be banging my head against the wall. And so I took a hiatus, not a brief hiatus, but a hiatus of about 8 years in doing my conferences. And then from the Intelligence Summit, I just spun off to my own organization, which I run, which is America Resurgent. And like I say, website not updated, but it is, we'll be doing a conference upcoming on Pearl Harbor Day, December 7th. And that will be soon to be up on americaresurgent.org. Some of the speakers, just to give you an idea, some color on what it's about, I will be doing it on critical race theory. Again, it speaks to identity. Critical race theory, which is the nonsense being taught in American schools, Marxist ideology, left-wing bias. It has infected, even more so, American military and intel, especially with this present administration in power there. And some of the people I'll have speaking are some of my old friends, comrades in arms, associates from the agency, CIA. Their names being former operations officer Claire Lopez, clandestine agency Jeff Stanow, and Dr. Peter Pry, who was an expert on the EMP weapon, and they will be speaking at the upcoming conference, December 7th. I will say, I joke about this because you lose your mind if you don't joke about some of these things. But when we first did the Intelligence Summit, I like to say we were 20 years ahead of our time. That was in, circa 2004. Now in the year 2021, we're probably 30 years ahead of your time. So you do the math on that, or you figure that one out. But we seem to be regressing. That's why I talk about the regressives, not the progressives. We seem to be moving backward. But that does not deter me, because in life, one has to go do what they have to do, meet their maker, and know they have a clean conscience. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Can I just ask you, did Nikki Haley ever attend any of your courses or your summits? Because she's in Israel now.
I have no problem with Nikki Haley coming.
No, I tell you, she's in Israel now, and she advocates exactly what you've just been saying. She actually is in Israel at the moment, and she said that a strong Israel makes a strong America. Exactly the word, like virtually word for word, what you're saying.
Yes, well, it is a viewpoint which is, I would say, intelligent. Not everybody in the intelligence community is intelligent, but there's a bit of an oxymoron there. But Nikki Haley is right on the money on that. And should you wish to contact me, if you wish to put me in contact with her, I would be happy to have her as a speaker. She is a prime candidate for the future. I approve of this message. I endorse Nikki Haley, but I want to go on record as being a strong supporter of President Trump as well, because I always think of the three Ps. The three Ps: politics should be about policy, not personality. So there are probably some things about President Trump's attitude that, his style was, a little bit, I would do differently. But I also understand his style because he's from a northeastern city, especially an inner city. So I get where he's coming from. And I commonly say that they think of him as rude and crude and sensitive. I think not. If I had been tarred and feathered, and have been, as a racist and right-wing fanatic and nut job and all of these things, and Adolf Hitler and a Nazi and a neo-Nazi and a white supremacist, if I had withstood that and undergone that for close to 5 years and had my family attacked repeatedly, I would not be as well behaved as President Trump is and was. Feel free to comment.
Asher, I don't know if you want to, I think you have different viewpoints.
I don't know where to start, really. This is me in 1974. I was the first Greek-American Jew Holocaust survivor to run for the assembly in Astoria, New York, on the Republican and liberal tickets. Republicans were saying in those days, I was a Rockefeller, Javits, Lefkowitz Republican. I don't know if those names resonate with you.
They absolutely do. Jacob Javits and Nelson Rockefeller.
Exactly. Absolutely. He came and supported me and wrote beautiful endorsements. It was a different kind. In 1964, we had the first right-wing candidate for president. He won over in the primary over Rockefeller in Goldwater. Today, he would be, of course, the most sane Republican in the bunch. But I, being the Jew, the proud Jew, and also the liberal means to be open-minded. Why there is a fight about against liberals, I cannot fathom. You want to be illiberal to be close-minded? This is rhetorical, how I present myself to those who say, liberals. Liberal means open. I'm conservative in some issues, social issues. I'm liberal in other issues. At any rate, I crossed the aisle and I voted for LBJ, never to return to vote for any of the subsequent presidential candidates on the Republican Party. I still am a Republican, thinking that the rhinos, I'm not the rhino, they are the rhinos, will come to their senses eventually. So I retain my Republican credentials, but I vote for the Democratic candidate on a third party line, so I would feel less guilty. That's one observation. I have another thing: sedition, S-I-N-D. And those three things, sedition, insurrection, and disloyal to spouses and the country, are three indictments, three allegations against, among so many, against a former president whom I will not mention, except by the number 45. I think that anybody could contemplate being in the same camp with him is needs re-examination. I think, not that you do, because you take good care of yourself. Another observation: since Mr. Truman endorsed and embraced Israel, albeit reluctantly because of George Marshall and the State Department, etc., but he did, for the sake of his partnership with his partnership with his business fellow. Every president, including our distinguished Nobel laureate Obama, tried to outdo the previous president in affection for the Jews and the Jewish state. You must understand that and appreciate that as he was leaving the White House, Obama signed a 10-year agreement to give Israel $30 billion in military aid over the 10-year span, and he tried to do what every president has tried to do, to find a solution to the Palestinian problem, which is there. It has been there since 1947 in the so-called two-state solution. And the fact that we have a president who has been embraced by the West Europeans and stands up for American values. What good is it to have power if it's only naked power and not soft power? And the previous administration denuded the State Department, and of course now it comes out, all those revelations about how he misused and abused the government, including the Justice Department, the press, everything that we stand for. What good? Is it to have an America that is a pariah, had become for 4 years a pariah state? It's just my observation. I am the president of B'nai B'rith, as it was mentioned in the 5 towns. And B'nai B'rith is one of the main organizations, major organizations in the conference of presidents of American Jewish organizations. And they were contemplating, can you imagine this? Contemplating censoring one of their number by the name of Zionist Organization of America, headed by Klein, by Morton Klein, for the longest period. He has embraced Trump, and Trump, oh, here I go, I mentioned his name, but that ilk of partisan politics that has made him inconsequential in my estimation.
Sure.
So that's another thing. I know you talk about power again. 2 articles I read yesterday that gave me such encouragement, because that is the Jewish spirit. The Tulsa massacre happened 100 years ago. Among those few who reached out to help their Black compatriots, citizens, were the few Jews who lived there, one of whom, by your namesake, Katz, Mr. Katz, a Lithuanian refugee or immigrant, um, was um, felt unease because the KKK surrounded Jewish homes and protested their involvement with the victims, and they had placards. And as they were marching past Katz's house, they had the sign, "Not you, Mr. Katz." You know, in other words, they made a distinction. That is truly tikkun olam. This is what I'm.
Asher, I have to add some notes here regarding what you just said. We've had these discussions for quite some time. Number one, when the real information comes out in the next few months about the false flag attack on January, I know you get your information from the New York Times, and
Not
I keep
only.
all right, and I keep telling you that the New York Times, which is the Carlos Slim Slimes, has not made a profit since 2008. It is not a real publication. If it was not for Carlos Slim's putting pesos in their pushkas, it would cease to exist today. Remember, that's my job from back at Reuters in the corporate reporting unit, to follow the money. And they lie consistently all the time. As I pointed out to you, no one in the Jewish community has apologized for participating in accusing President Trump, because no one can ever lose face, for Russian collusion. And the loudest mouths in that, Rachel Maddow and Jake Tapper and other people, Zucker from CNN, which is also not real. These are corporate fascist mouthpieces. That was shown to be a complete lie. Has anyone in the Jewish community apologized to heap this abuse on President Trump? Not one. Another point I continue to make to you is the reference to Khrushchev's speech about Stalin in March 1956 about Stalin's crimes. The biggest mouths and the biggest liars in the 10 to 20 years after that, who continued to lie and say, no, that's a conspiracy theory. Stalin, who's the son of all the nations, S-U-N, and that never happened, with the Jewish communist Stalinists. And one of the worst of all was Lillian Hellman, who, even knowing when it was true, lied and lied and lied and lied and lied. The same situation we're going to have in the next few months when the audits come in, because again, no one in the Jewish and Israeli community, the emperor always has to have clothes. So I live in a nudist colony here. No matter what happens, no one can ever lose face. It is nonstop. No one has apologized. Now, another point is you make these, we've discussed this before, these general vague references to misuse of the Department of Justice.
Sorry, can I just, because I have to leave, but I just want to end off and then you'll continue. John Kerry said something very interesting. He said that Israel will never make peace with its Arab neighbors until the Palestinian conflict is resolved. And tonight, in about another 6 more minutes, I'm going to be together with the UAE, where we're having this, as I mentioned, this multinational international exhibition. And in the UAE, they've just opened a Holocaust museum. And Israel did make peace with not only the UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, Sudan. It's unbelievable. So,
Right.
you know, we have to look at the broad spectrum, and there's good and bad in everything, but let's look at the broad spectrum. But miracles do happen, and Israel actually did make peace, this incredible peace. And I'm going to be actually speaking to somebody from the UAE in 6 more minutes. So I have to leave. Robert, it's been a tremendous pleasure to meet you, and we look forward to hopefully meeting you again in the future.
Amen.
I'm going to hand over to Lowell. I'll
Thank
still
you.
keep it going because I really want to hear the responses, and it's been very enlightening for me. And you really, Robert, you're an example. You really are. I'm so proud to hear somebody standing up for Israel and the Jewish people, and you're a real hero, modern day hero, in my opinion. And I cannot tell you how much I appreciate what you do and what you have done and what you will continue to do, because we
Amen.
need people like you. We really do. And I'm just overwhelmed from what I've heard from you tonight, and I really want to thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Glassman. The feeling is mutual.
Les, thanks for continuing the recording in case mine conks out.
Thank you, Les.
So now the other point about the Department of Justice. As I wrote you privately, the investigation into Eric Swalwell and Adam Schiff was perfectly legal, done not with the FISA, not misused with the way they did it with Trump, with phony depositions. It's all been exposed as complete fraud. The investigation this isn't a question of whether you're a Democrat, a Republican, left wing, right wing, or chicken wing. We're dealing here with facts. Remember, with me, you're talking to someone on the autistic spectrum, which means high functioning autist Asperger's. We don't emotionalize data. Today is Tuesday, whether I like it or not. Now, in the Jewish and Israeli world, data is always emotionalized. That's why no one can ever admit anything. As we discussed privately, Asher, Eric Swalwell was literally in bed with a communist Chinese agent. Even the make-believe media doesn't dispute that. Was done completely legally, and what's coming out in the next few months, and I don't expect anyone in the 5 towns to admit they were wrong. And the New York, Carlos Slim slime will attempt to spin the story, of course, as long as they can. And furthermore, Adam Schiff, wait till they get started. The Standard Hotel with the male prostitutes who were murdered there, yes, that's real. And that's just the beginning of sorrows for both of them. They are both traitors to the United States. And what Trump, who you don't like so much, again, the psychopathology at work here, that after President Trump moved the embassy to Jerusalem, the annual meeting of the federations of Jewish organizations said, we're so mad about that, we're not going to have the meeting in Jerusalem, we're going to have it in Tel Aviv. And then acknowledging the Golan, and then having Mike Pompeo visit Sagot, the winery, and the Golan. And now on a passport, if you want in Jerusalem, can have you can say Jerusalem, Israel ad infinitum. And yet the so-called Jewish community, maybe these are Goyish souls recycled into Jewish bodies, at the very least, you're dealing with extreme psychopathology here, which I can only ascribe to centuries of Stockholm syndrome as the result of persecution primarily by the Roman Catholic Eastern Orthodox, and you know about the state Protestant churches in which the ability of Jews to think rationally is totally deformed. I have no problem with someone being whatever they are. I do have a problem with pretending, lying, and make-believe. And I went through that in 1992 when we came here on April 1st, April Fool's Day, and the so-called peace process, which was a death process from the beginning began. It was bad enough, the buses blowing up, and the cafes blowing up. But the pretending, lying, and make-believe by our establishment press that we have a peace process, that made it worse. No one in London during the Blitz pretended they had a peace process with Nazi Germany, in which 50,000 people were killed from August 1940 to May 1941, including 5,000 children. But here for years, again, remember, Israel is established by Jewish communists and socialists. And the same people who participated in ruining Russia created a shtetl on steroids from the Pale of Settlement, in which on the surface it looks like you have a democracy, but if you look under the surface, you don't. I'll give you 2 examples of that, then we'll hand this back to our host. Israel did have separate elections for prime minister, and the people who pushed that said, we need democracy, the so-called democracy. And so like the KGB had an America Institute. As soon as they saw it wasn't electing who they want, all of a sudden it wasn't democratic. They raised the threshold. It's going to produce more democracy to give people less choices which parties they vote for. And now we have logjam and less choices. So democracy, schmocracy. In Israel, you can be forbidden from leaving the country from all sorts of reasons. You don't even have ability to travel freely. They don't want you to know that abroad. So there's all sorts of things where the people in the deep structure of Israeli society who have real power want things ke'ilu, that means sort of to look like it's democratic, where in fact, it ain't. Don't get me started on what we went through here until 2005 with the Gush Katif expulsion, Whereas it was pointed out by one essayist on the Professor Michel Kossadovsky's very anti-Israel, he doesn't really say what is persist. Trotskyites, the Stalinists, I'm not sure. His mother's Irish, his father was a Jewish communist. As Rabbi Kahane said, we support every cause except their own. If you have a bad day, it's the fault of Israel, America, and England. So one of his essays put in one sentence what happened here. Israel withdrew from Gaza, the rockets kept falling, and the left collapsed, meaning that the Jewish and Israeli capacity for pretending, lying, and make-believe reached its limit, which we can't take this anymore. We can't take your state-sponsored terrorism from our left-wing labor dying establishment. We don't want to die anymore. Thousands of people got killed, thousands more were wounded, and the whole country suffers from not PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, but permanent traumatic distress disorder. We brought in Hamas and the Philistine chaos. We brought them in. Israeli companies make money on doing business with them, like some of them did business with the Nazis during the Holocaust. They don't want you to know that. There's big bucks in supplying Hamas-occupied Gaza and Philistine chaos occupied their regions with gas, water, electricity, big bucks. And the people who benefit from that don't want that to change. And who suffers the most, if you actually talk to Arabs and Muslims when they don't think anyone's listening, why did you do this to us? You brought them to us. But of course, no one in the American Jewish community can ever say sorry, admit it, they make a mistake. Yossi Bilan, and most of them are dead, fortunately, who did this. But I'll conclude with one remark before giving it back to Dr. Katz, who works with John Loftus, who wrote 2 books. America's friendly to Israel. As John Loftus says in The Secret War Against the Jews, America as a people are friendly to Israel, but our intelligence agencies since the beginning have been doing whatever they can to see that Israel gets destroyed. And he has another book called Unholy Trinity about the Vatican Bank and the Nazis and where the money went and the gold from the teeth went. And the American industrialists and bankers who did business with the Nazis before, during, and after the war was never prosecuted. That's why there was no prosecution at Nuremberg of the Thesens and the Krupps, because it would have led back to the Bushes and the Harrimans and the Dulles brothers and the Watsons and the Fords. They didn't want it. So what did Ron Pundak, one of the architects of the Oslo death process, say in a moment of rare and uncharacteristic honesty? He said, this wasn't about peace with the Palestinians, and never mind, there aren't any Palestinians. There are Arab tribes, clans, and families in the land of Israel. And if Yitzchak ben Tzvi is right, and Tzvi Messina is right, many of them are descended from Jews who never left. Hello, Midsummer Night's Dream. He said, the reason we did this is we wanted people in Israel to think of themselves not as Jews, but as Israelis. In other words, Hebrew-speaking Gentiles, as Rabbi Kahane said. And this gets back to what Dr. Katz is talking about in terms of identity. So for me, a tragedy is, till today, the Gush Katif catastrophe, and also for the Arabs there. Actually, they're Chechens. Most of the people in Gaza are from Chechnya from a couple of hundred years ago. Israel has about 900 different ethnic and religious groups. People don't know that, not just Jews. Uzbeki Muslims and Chechens and Circassians and groups we never even heard of. They suffered more than we did. Thousands of Arabs who worked with us were betrayed by Shimon Peres and his friends, the Palestinian Authority, to be murdered. How's that for being able to count on the Jews and the Israelis and in southern Lebanon? And the line goes on forever. I have no problem with people believing what they want to believe. I do have problem with make-believe. I do have a problem that on Rosh Hashanah 2000, when the second Intifada started, a Druze soldier, Madchat Yusuf, was left to die, bleed to death in the arms of his commander, Colonel Sulawi. There's a village north of Tiberias, all Arab Muslims who came from Arabia, and most of them are in the intelligence, army, and police units, allowed to die, bleed to death because 2 traitors and criminals, Benny Gantz, the general, and Ehud Barak, decided we're not going to go and save him. That's treason. You don't do that. Until today, the Madchat family from the Galilee has not accepted. Well, no one offers any apologies here for anything, have not forgiven. Why should they forgive and forget that? And why should the people from the Munich massacre forgive and forget that our treasonous ghetto capoocracy put in Mahmoud Abbas, who was one of the masterminders of the 1970 what was it, 1972, the Munich Olympics, the murders there. So we have a lot of problems here in Israel with people who are very much in the spirit of Rudolf Kastner. They collaborated with the Nazis, the transfer agreement of the labor Zionists, and they'll do business with anyone as they can put some pesos in their pockets, especially abroad, and betray their own people. This is not a left-wing or a right-wing issue. This is a treason patriot issue. The same thing in the United States. I'm waiting for one, and I agree with Dr. Katz. There are no leaders in the American Jewish community. In general, there are schlemiels in suits. Any one of them to apologize to President Trump, whether you like him or not, for the abuse heaped on him for Russian collusion when it never happened. Not one. What does that say? Because not men, they're bugs. A real man, you talked to me about how in Greek culture.
The Mueller report was not released in total. You know.
Oh, come on, Ashi, you're just fooling yourself. And again, as more evidence comes out every day, you're trying to save face. No, because it's out and more will come out.
I'm a proud Jew. I'm willing.
Good. So if you're a proud Jew, 5 months from now,
4 months will come and go, and there will not be any such revelation that will exonerate the previous president.
It is not the president who needs to be exonerated. It's the American Jewish community and their schlemiels and suits who have the nerve to call themselves leaders. And not one of them. Let's leave President Trump on the side. Yasser Arafat, whose real name is Abdul Rauf al-Khodbi al-Husseini, the Egyptian from Alexandria, is a mass murderer. And the money that went from us into his accounts abroad didn't go to help Arabs in Israel. And when it was, you talk about a peace prize to Obama, the only prizes that matter in the Nobel Prizes are the science prizes. The peace and literate prizes are BS. Science is real. Okay, so you got a prize. Shimon Peres got a prize. That doesn't mean anything for nothing. Gertrude Stein nominated Adolf Hitler for the Peace Prize. Naturally a Jew. So I have a problem with make-believe. I have a problem with Jewish Stalinist communists or their equivalents today who when it's already started to come out. With the forensic audits, there are teams now from all over the country going down there to Arizona. When it comes out and the involvement of prominent Jews in this, in the dying DC deep state Democratic Rhino Republican establishment, when this comes out, you'll see a lot of Lillian Hellmans who will continue to lie and say, no, this is not true. These are conspiracy theories, because from what I see, and then I'll conclude and give it over to Dr. Katz. When Ben-Gurion met with Truman, Truman said, and this apparently conversation took place, that I am the president of 250 million Americans. Ben-Gurion replied, I am the prime minister of 2 million presidents. I have no objection to presidents. I do have a problem with bullshit artists. And I agree with Dr. Katz. There are few, if any, leaders in the American Jewish community as there were before, during, and after the Holocaust, when their main activity was sabotaging Hillel Kook. Peter Bergson, who was coming, he got a lot of support from Gentiles to expose the Holocaust, and who was sabotaging him? Stephen Weiss and the American Jewish Committee in Congress. And nothing has changed. Have they learned? Max Frankel from your glorious New York Times at least had the decency after he retired to publish an expose about they did whatever they could to cover up in terms of their reporting what was going on about the Holocaust. That's why, in my opinion, a friendly Gentile is always better than a court Jew, and Alexander Haig is always better than Henry Kissinger. I'm not going to start on that and what really happened in the Yom Kippur War and in the summer before the pre-planned Yom Kippur War, and why it was pre-planned so that the Arab countries would have the opportunity to triple the world oil prices and their profits and the oil companies and use that as an excuse. It gets worse. Now I give it back to Dr. Katz, who's talking to us about Jewish identity. And I wish you would tell him something about how you were saved in that cave, because you know what anti-Jew hatred means. You lived through it, and you can talk about the Greek Orthodox Church till today, what they say, what their official line is about Jews and how Jews are treated in Greece. But I'd like to hear what Dr. Katz has to say. Then we'll come back to you.
My segue to the other article that I wanted to raise. It was printed about reaction in the Greek American community, taking umbrage with the fact that the Archbishop, apropos of his predecessor, Jacobus, who marched with Martin Luther King in Selma, Alabama, in recent months, he marched, the new Archbishop, Elpidophorus, which means a herald for hope. He marched in the Black Lives Matter march in the city, and he was castigated and continues to be castigated. Again, and it's so reflective of the anti-Semitism of the Greek community, as you alluded in my own experience, but it is also a kind of an out that many Jews, some Jews, especially in the 5 towns, are ready to point to and say, we should not support Black Lives Matter because of some of the anti-Semites that are included. I say that doesn't obscure the basic issue of our times, which goes back 400 years. Project 1619 is alive today, but for the abortion of the Reconstruction in 1976 with the unholy bargain, giving the presidency back to the Republicans in exchange for Democrats agreeing to withdraw the federal troops from the South, and that postponed the kind of reforms that we need to do in America. We need to get rid of the remnants of Jim Crow. We need to embrace our Black compatriots. I mean, we of all people must know that we were strangers in a strange land, and we found our promised land. And they are the only group that was forced to come to America.
And Asher, what does that have to do with Dr. Katz speaking about Jewish identity? And as you know, more and more—
well, part of the identity—
You know, if I may interrupt, in a sense, it has everything to do with my speaking about Jewish identity. This indeed is the problem. This indeed is the problem. I will be respectful. I am, after all is said and done, I've earned the title of gentleman. I do not think I could possibly disagree more with Professor Asher. I will not destroy his arguments and rebuke his arguments out of respect to his title and out of respect to his upbringing. But at age 77, to feel this way, that Barack Obama was nothing short of a godsend, a glorious Nobel laureate, to be a strong supporter of Black Lives Matter, what can I say? You need to do an entire series on Jewish identity.
The founder of Black Lives Matter just was exposed as taking millions for private homes. Maxine Waters, who doesn't even live in— now remember, my father had a practice in the South Bronx. His clients were Blacks and Puerto Ricans from 1952. I was in the Spanish, meaning Cuban, and Puerto Rican Day Parade 1960. Maxine Waters lives in a multi-million-dollar home with money. Where did she earn it? Not even in her district. These people are stepping, fetch-it, carpet bailing scalawags, and they do not represent the Black people. Al Sharpton, the biggest phony of all, going to one of these rallies, left in a private jet. Now, there are real Black entrepreneurs and what's his name, that sheriff, who are emerging and saying, we're not going to be the house niggers of the Democratic Party for what you want from us. They are emerging. There is Vernon Jones, one of the places in which there's been the most progress of African Americans, most of whom are Igbos who came over from the Igbo people who are still Christian in southern Nigeria. He's running for governor of Georgia. There's a tremendous number of blacks moving into leadership positions on the merits, Burgess Owens, all over the country. And they're not just the. So when you talk Black Lives Matter is funded, is a Marxist communist front organization of stormtroopers. How can any Jew be suckered into having anything to do with them? And another one is leaving now too, from Detroit or someplace. He said, I was suckered and I thought this was real. They're jumping ship. And a lot of the money that went to Black Lives Matter through their phony website went straight to the Joe Biden's re-election campaign, a man who doesn't even remember his own name. And will soon be replaced by Kamala Harris before they're all thrown out when Trump comes back.
Along with Dr. Katz and Lowell, I must, in all due respect, remind you that upwards of 70% of the Jewish people, American Jews, do not belong in your wing of
Since
Judaism.
when is truth
And that's
determined
why
by
the Jewish
majority?
community is in such trouble.
Yeah, the Jewish
That's why
community
the
is
Jewish
falling
community
apart.
is in
Since
such
when
dire
is
straits.
when is
I don't know
truth
if it's-
determined by majority vote? When is truth determined by majority vote? Most of the so-called Jewish leaders supported the Oslo
In
death
a
process.
democracy, we have an expression.
Professor, you can do better than this. That is a straw man argument. So you say that because they are in the majority, foolishly so, then we must be wrong. That is absurd.
Give me, you have to marshal more convincing arguments, and I don't think.
Nothing will persuade you, sir. I've made arguments against your ilk, to use your wording, my entire life. Nothing
Yeah,
else.
Asher, nothing will persuade you, no matter what facts come out in the next 6 months, because you are a true believer in, I'm not sure
I'm
what
not
exactly.
I'm an
You know,
open.
you talk
But
about a
it-
16, 19.
Apparently, Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, Alexandria
No,
Ocasio
terrible,
Cortez,
yes.
Al
Oh,
Sharpton, none
I
of these
mentioned-
people seem
I
to bother
mentioned
you.
two-
Black Lives Matter, that's a nice phrase. But meanwhile, let me tell you something, sir. I grew up in a Black neighborhood. Yes,
Yeah.
I know what racism is about, all over this body. I grew up in the neighborhood where Louis Farrakhan was born. His real name was Louis Harris. He was taught the violin by Mr. Mendelssohn, one of our neighbors. Yes, I know what racism is. I have scars all over my body from it, okay? Do not instruct me about racism. I experienced racism, Black on white, specifically Black on Jew. And the Jews of Boston, Kivy Kaplan, we were prominent in Boston. We helped the Blacks with civil rights in Boston. Do not instruct me, sir.
Yeah, and there were many Black leaders, real Black leaders.
My
like-
neighborhood had the highest murder rate in the nation. The neighborhood of Roxbury. Look it up.
Roxbury.
I grew, born in Roxbury, grew up in Dorchester, Mattapan. So before you open a mouth, please, sir, do your research and due diligence.
I know.
Yeah, where you live, you don't live with Blacks. You live in the 5 towns with liberal, whatever that means, Jews. My father's whole practice in 1952 on was with Blacks and Puerto Ricans. And I remember a widow visiting because her husband had been beaten to death by young Blacks. He was a lawyer who worked with my father. So don't talk about Blacks because you don't live with them, you don't have an experience with them. Black Lives Matter does not represent the Black community. It's a Marxist stormtrooper organization funded by your friend George Soros to burn down cities in Democratic controlled states where the police were told to stand down and not defend the citizenry. They have nothing to do with the Black community in the United States. They may have big mouths like Maxine Waters, but fortunately, real Black leaders are emerging all over the countries who believe in America. And a Black leader, anyone who believes in America will always be pro-Israel. And anyone says they believe in America and they're not pro-Israel, as some people I've met in the white community, are remakes of Father Charles Coughlin, Senator Burton Wheeler, Henry Ford, and Charles Lindbergh. These are the new American Nazis. That's on the right. I want to leave that on the side. So, but I want to get back to with Dr. Katz talking about Jewish identity, whatever that means, and how to restore that. From what I can see, statistically, with the intermarriage rate at 70%, in about 2 generations, if it takes that long, there won't even be a Jewish community. There will be a Jewish community among the religiously observant in Israel and in America, but as far as I can see, the American Jewish community is disappearing. How do you strengthen Jewish identity without reference to faith in God and observance of his commandments? The old identity, Dr. Katz, that existed after World War II has mostly faded away. I don't know how you do that. It seems to me the American Jewish community will disappear like the Jewish community of Alexandria 2,000 years ago. And by the way, the person who burned the temple was a Jew. Tiberius, he was the nephew of Philo the philosopher, the Moses Mendelssohn of our time. He burned the temple. I don't know why we have a city named after him. It should be called Trumperius, in my opinion. I don't know. So I still want to know, Dr. Katz, what do you think can be done to strengthen Jewish identity without reference to traditional Jewish faith?
Well, that is the billion-dollar question, and I think I opened things up by saying that there is no easy answer. It is a multifaceted answer. But yes, you are correct, Mr. Gallen, that there has to be a renewal of faith amongst the Jewish community, observance, religious tradition, but there also has to be a strong identification with Jewish history, with Jewish knowledge, with support of Israel. As far as I'm concerned, you can be the most religious Jew imaginable. If you are not a strong supporter, a strong proponent of Israel, then to me, you are only fooling yourself. As far as I'm concerned, if you kowtow, if you try to appease segments of American society, which not only take your support for granted, but disrespect you and laugh and mock you behind your back, then the hope for the American community is diminishing. And the American community will fade out, but it will take some time. I expect it will take pretty much going for the next 50, 60 years to slowly taper off and fade out. In the meantime, the state of Israel will become, God willing, stronger and stronger, Be'ezrat Hashem. Okay, but what this discussion today has brought up a number of factors, and to my way of thinking, it's all about Jewish identity. I think the attitudes of Professor Asher will not serve the Jewish nation well. I think the identification with characters such as Barack Obama and whatnot will not serve the Jewish community well. 70% of Jews voting for the Democratic Party is a shanda, is a disgrace. Not only
the Democratic Party of today is not the Democratic Party of Senator Daniel Inouye or Scoop Jackson or Harry Truman or Reuben Humphrey. It's been gutted. In fact, it's been identified the 4 socialist and communist groups that have infiltrated them. I forgot their names, and I read a study once who's infiltrated what's in effect a dead body and taken it over. Now, one may like or not like those groups, but the fact that they've taken it over is a fact. It's not a conspiracy theory. And many of the people in the party are not aware of what has happened. They don't follow the money, for example, and they don't know how they're being used as useful idiots, as what was it Lenin said of intellectuals in the West.
Lenin is laughing.
Useful idiots.
Lenin is laughing. I think it was Ronald Reagan. Heaven forbid, right, Professor Asher, the name President Ronald Reagan, but it was Ronald Reagan that said, I did not leave the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party left me.
I understand.
And as far as I'm concerned, let me finish, please.
Government
Let me finish, please.
is the root
As
of
far as I'm
problem rather
concerned,
than the solution.
the Democratic Party of Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who was the UN ambassador, and Phil Scoop Jackson, I helped him
Right.
in a very minor, small way with the emigration of Russian Jewry and the free trade agreement. those were Democrats. And Mr. Gallen brought up a good point before, and you brought up a point, Professor Asher, one of the
Yes,
few good
Asher.
ones you made about liberal. I protest. I am the true liberal. I am the true liberal. A true conservative is the true liberal. So what the hell does that mean? It means I believe in minority rights. I believe in the rights of women. I believe in the rights of homosexuals. I am tolerant towards all groups. I want all groups to be tolerant towards me and show respect towards me and my accomplishments, not me personally, but the accomplishments of the Jewish people. That is Jewish pride. That is Jewish identity.
Also, the issue of George Orwell points out, one of the points of 1984 by Eric Blair's George Orwell is.
Let me interject here. George Orwell was right about everything. He was only wrong about one thing.
What that?
It wasn't 1984, it's now.
Right. So he said, if you want to corrupt people's thinking, corrupt the terminology. So I will ask people when I talk to them, what do you mean by liberal? What do you mean by progressive? I'm for Motherhood America and a hot lunch for orphans. Well, who isn't? What do those terms mean? I don't even know if the people using them know what they mean. Now, when you get to Marxist, Leninist, Trotskyite, Maoist, Stalinist, those terms have meanings. And often the people who represent those views will obscure them, so that Irving Kristol, who became a leading so-called neoconservative when he was young, was a Trotskyite. Mayor Warren Wilhelm Jr., his real name from New York, de Blasio was his mother's name, was a Trotskyite in college. I saw that on his own Wikipedia entry. After I started to write about it, I don't know if there was a connection or not, that reference disappeared. There's a Trotskyite by his own admission on his own self-edited page. Then the person could ask, what does that mean to be a Trotskyite, a Stalinist, a Maoist, a Marxist, a Leninist? Words have meaning. So the word progressive or liberal has become contentless. What does that mean? I don't know what it means. I think most of the people using it don't have any idea what it means. If you would tell me Eugene Debs was a reform what?
Theodore Roosevelt wanted to.
That's 100 years ago. You're talking.
Trust, for example.
That's 100 years ago when it had a meaning. And when Eugene Debs was a socialist, it had a meaning. But today,
because life is progressive.
The people who use these terms in general don't have the faintest idea what they're talking about.
Professor Asher, you're underestimating yourself, sir. You're underestimating yourself, sir. You're better than this. You are not to be taken in by use of a word and say, oh, progressive, that means they believe in progress. Well, I believe in progress too, so I'll be a progressive. You're better than this, Professor Asher.
Hey, Professor Matatheus.
I sort of agree, but Lowell asks for something more specific of how we can rejuvenate or have an resurgence in American Jewish life. And I come back with 3 proposals. I'm dismayed on campus, in many campuses, including Columbia, where my brother went to medical school, that so many anti-Israel and anti-Jewish, so much sentiment against them exists among the Gentile crowd, who are ready to, of course, pass resolutions for the BDS movement, etc.
Okay.
The leading BDS professors are Jews. At NYU, one of the leading BDS professors is a Jew.
Listen,
Jews are leaders in this. Why do you say Gentiles?
I'm leading to something else. I'm saying that that the students themselves are not able, Jewish students are not able to defend themselves because they lack some basic Jewish education. So, for example, the revival of the yeshivas, some kind of yeshiva education to go along with secular education that will be subsidized by the greater Jewish community. It's very expensive to send kids to yeshivot. The other thing is to send loads of Jewish kids to your neighborhood there, Lowell, and the Birthright Israel, for example. But
even that's been corrupted in terms of who they get to see and speak to by people with a radical left-wing agenda. I've been reading reports
Everything the
about that too.
left touches, everything the left touches, it ruins.
Now, I want to say something about Jew hatred on campuses,
Yeah.
because that's been rising in the last 40 years, is again, follow the money. And this is, when I wrote my, right, when I wrote my book, Cracking the Quran Code, God's Land, Torah, and People Covenants with Israel in the Quran and Islamic Tradition, there's an endorsement for that from John Loftus and Colonel Ralph Peters. But it was written under the supervision of Muslim scholars, Sheikh Abdul Hadi Palazzi and Sheikh Abdulaziz Bukhari, who's no longer alive, was the head of the Uzbeki Muslim community in Israel. And in the book, which is a series of essays and then sections analyzing how the Quran deals with the land covenant, the Torah covenant, the people covenant, Jerusalem, the three temples, and according to their own commentators, I have an essay by Sheikh Palazzi, his talk at the Interdisciplinary Center Countering Suicide Terrorism Conference in February 2000, which he describes the history of the Wahhabi movement. Follow the money. The primary source for funding the spread of Jew hatred, thinly masqueraded, they don't even masquerade anymore, as pro-Palestinian, anti-Israel, is Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and the Gulf states. Now these, I don't even want to call them states, they're Bedouin tribal crime family fiefdoms. Most of them are Wahhabi in theology and petrodollar profit in their funding. I'm sorry to say, in cooperation with the Anglo-American oil and banking establishment. They funded this for 40 years, and it has borne fruit. So we shouldn't be surprised that there's this Jew hatred, and then it's drawing on, as Asher, we've discussed about Eastern Orthodoxy, classical Christian Jew hatred. This is going back 19th centuries, which is in everybody's blood in Western Europe, whether they're conscious of it or not. To say, I hate the Christ-killing kikes and deicide murdering yids of my classical Christian theology. I'm not dealing with the Christian Zionists or the Restorationists or the independent churches at this point, but with Roman Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, and state Protestant Christianity.
Evangelical.
No, put that on the side for a second, because they accept the land and the people covenants, but they still accept it when it comes to the Torah. If you don't believe in Jesus, you're the Christ-killing kikes and deicide murdering yids. This is from the church fathers and is pumped into their heads for 1900 years. Now, whether they're religiously observant.
Mr. Gallen, I have a bit of comic relief that might shed some light on this.
I'm listening.
May I tell the story?
Yeah.
We can stand it. Go ahead.
Okay, when I was in about the grade school, about the ninth, 10th grade, and this again speaks to Jewish identity, because identity is all about knowing who you are and standing up for who you are. So to speak to your point, and I do have a point somewhere in all this verbiage and all this blizzard of words. When I was in about the 10th grade, there was a Greek Orthodox fellow by the name of Thaddeus, taken from, I guess, the New Testament, who said to me, you know, you're a kike, you killed my God, you killed Christ.
Right.
And I said, Thaddeus, couldn't have been me. I had a dentist appointment at the time. But if
And
you
what
like,
did Thaddeus
we
say?
can go out and discuss this. We can go out to the street and discuss it. That in a nutshell, think about that. That in a nutshell encompasses all of what you just said.
Right.
The charges
Asher,
that they aside go on forever, but unless you stand up to them and confront
Right.
the bully,
Yeah.
as
Asher-
Israel does as a nation state, yes.
Lord,
Personally, it has to be done as well. How do you combat anti-Israel bias on campus? To know the facts, number one, and then speak the truth about the facts. To do that second, I would not advise doing that unless you really know how to take care of yourself physically, because physical intimidation is always on the menu with these groups and you are always outnumbered. So there you
Right.
go.
right. Asher knows what this means because he was hidden by a Greek family. The Nazi officer who came in with his squad saw this little baby and said, that looks like my little boy in Hamburg. And he told his soldiers, we weren't here, they're not here, and we're not coming back. His family was saved, was hidden by a Greek family. But he found out many years later that it was the intention of the Greek Christian family that had the parents died, They had another name they were going to give him and not tell him anything about his Jewish ancestry. But there was a righteous bishop, a priest, who said, no, you can't do that. That's not right. You have to give him back to his family. So he knows about that. Why I mention that is that these people with the Jew hatred know that they had to repackage it. It's not even that you're we're pro-Palestinian. And for the people in the West say, look, I can't openly, after the Holocaust, it doesn't sound nice to talk about things like Sadius. So I have to repackage, I'm pro-Palestinian. So that they knew their audience, which is, we know your traditional Jew hatred that you've learned from your churches, not their fault. That's what they taught and still teach. That's normative theology. They're not going to deal with the philo-Judaic groups. They exist, but normative for the main churches is still replacement supersessionist theology. So it works very well. Furthermore, as Sheikh Palazzi said, that most of the so-called Muslim Jew hatred was imported by Christian missionaries in the 19th centuries. If you read what they write and say, they had their own shtick about Jews before that, but it was different. The term, the blood libels and the this and the that, they, like in 1840 in Damascus, they got these images and ideas from Christian missionaries. So
well, yes, that might be one minor point of disagreement, Mr. Gallen. Yes, they did. You are, of course, correct. However, the Quran is rife with anti-Jewish sentiments.
Wait a second. What the Quran has, I have to add this. The Quran affirms the land Torah and people covenants with Israel. Then anti-Jewish statements in the Quran have to be seen within the context of its affirmation of those covenants. And furthermore, this is, you can read my 500-page research book. That's why you have an Islamic Zionist movement. You have in the Tanakh, very so-called anti-Jewish statements in the prophets. What they do is criticize failures of mainly the ruling classes in the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Judah, but always within the context of affirming you're God's chosen people, you were given the land, and you were given the Torah. That's why I spent 3 years preparing the book with every single verse in the Quran that deals with that. I'll give you an example. It says in the Quran that Jews were turned into detested apes. This is quoted a lot, but people who quote that, leave out the second half of the sentence. The 4 or 5 references which say that say Jews who don't observe Shabbat and keep kashrut were turned into detested apes. Another point that is made is that Jerusalem is.
Well, I am gratified that they are so concerned about my Jewish observance. I appreciate that.
That may be true. Why I say this is you have an increasing number of Muslims around the world who are Zionists, like Sheikh Palazzi and Sheikh Bukhari, because they acknowledge this. This is not well known to Jews in the United States who are not familiar with traditional Islamic teachings. And unfortunately, as John Loftus writes about in The Secret War Against the Jews, with the rise of the Wahhabi movement, have been among our most terrible enemies. But that's a whole nother point I don't want to get into now. We're talking about Jewish identity here and how to maintain it. I will send you the link to my book. It's for free download through academia.edu. And as Sheikh Palazzi said, it's beautiful. American Jews bought into the Wahhabi propaganda. Wonderful. But fortunately, I'll give you one example. We live in Abu Tur for 25 years on the border of the Arab their section. And because of the bombings, and we didn't have a car, we wouldn't send our girls to school on the buses. We used an Arab taxi service called Hadar for 2 reasons. 1, they came on time, and 2, they didn't argue with you about the price. And we would do the taxi driver test. And the test was like this. I said, listen, I know that in your Quran, it says that God gave the land of Israel to the Jews. Now, what do you think the taxi driver said in response to that? My wife would do it and I would do that. In every case except for one, they said, that's true. You know that? Why don't your leaders say that? And I asked Ariel Sharon once this at a press conference for the Foreign Press Association. I took out my Quran and I took out the verses. This is God. It says very clearly, God gave the land of Israel to the children of Israel. Not only that, Told you to fight for it. It's all over the place. I said, why don't you quote these verses, even according to their own commentators? He gave you the Torah, you're his chosen people. He gave you the land. And furthermore, it says in Surah 17, verse 101 through 104, he'll bring you back at the end of days, which he did. Why don't you quote this? So Ariel Sharon was sitting with a person whose name I don't want to mention. And Ariel Sharon just looked at me. And the guy sitting next to him giggled and said, well, you know, there's no possibility of making peace with them anyway. So it didn't get through the gefilte fish. I said, well, if there's no possibility of making peace with them anyway, why are you talking to the Palestinian Authority and these groups? And furthermore, he said, there's no reference to King David and King Solomon in the Quran. So I wrote to the other guy privately afterwards and said, wait a minute, do you have a different Quran from me? There are 10 or 15 hello, baby, Elijah.
Elijah. Eliyahu HaNavi has arrived. The prophet.
There are 10 or 15 references in the Quran to King David and King Solomon. And King David is called a prophet as well as a judge and a king. What do you think was the response of his advisor? Thank you, I learned something new. After that, he never spoke to me again. Why? Because the Jewish and Israeli emperor always has to have clothes and can never lose face. All you have to do is stand up in the UN. Your prime minister, your president, your speaker of the Knesset, the ambassador, just read it. No, it just doesn't get through the gefilte fish. And then another thing is you'll see an ad like from Elie Wiesel they had in the New York Times. There's no reference to Jerusalem, in the Quran. Well, as a matter of fact, there are many references to Jerusalem in the Quran. When you look at their commentators, which then cite the book of Nehemiah and Ezekiel, they read it, they knew it. You read what they say, it sounds like Jabotinsky. There's another book, there's no reference to Jerusalem. It's called the Torah. There's no reference to Jerusalem, the entire Torah. There are verses we interpret as referring to that. But that's a whole nother issue on the side where American Jews who meanwhile bought into the Wahhabi propaganda, it's all there in the text. But again, no one can ever lose face. But let's go back to Jewish identity to conclude the program, Dr. Katz. You work with John Loftus and people in intelligence and the military. It would seem to me, I heard what Professor Mattathias said about yeshivot, that a critical element would be teaching Jewish and Israeli history. We had a girl take care of our baby before we came to Israel. She was from the Beit Yaakov school. She didn't even know who Ben Gurion was. You don't have to like him, but at least know who he is. She never heard of him. It's now 2021. How many kids here know about Joseph Trumpeldor and Tel Chai?
None.
1920. Anything. What do they know about Michael Jackson or some nitwit singer they listen to on their smartphones? It would seem to me that it would be, I don't know what you can do to teach Jewish kids better history, whatever movement there.
It has to start with the parent, okay? I am no paragon of virtue, or I'm not an especially perceptive fellow, but I know one thing I always try to instill in my three sons. That's a great name. I think I might start a TV program by that name.
Good idea.
I always, in original too, I always try to instill in them a pride, a positive Jewish pride about, the accomplishments of Jewish history. So let me say one other thing, which might be off the topic, but I think it's very much on topic, and that is Bibi is no longer on the political scene. Israel would do well to, for the first time, seriously take the formation of a Hasbara department and have ambassadors, emissaries, really fanning out all over the world, speaking of the Jewish accomplishments. And I'm going to start a lecture series in this vein, the Jewish accomplishments in medicine, science, technology, agriculture, military, wastewater management, whatever you want, to highlight some of the incredible work that has been done by Jews and Israeli Jews in all these various fields.
20% of the Nobel laureates, 20% of the Nobel laureates are Jewish.
Yes, and what I commonly say to that is I commonly get these emails where boasting, kvelling in Yiddish about all the Jewish Nobel laureates. The fact of the matter is, many of those sending around these emails are not that bright, but they take vicarious pleasure in the Jewish
I give you an
Nobel.
example of how right you are. 3 composers that are world famous and much beloved who are all Jewish. Hans Zimmer, James Horner, who wrote the theme song for Titanic, and what is his name, who wrote The Lord of the Rings, Howard Shore. They don't hide the fact that they're Jew, but let's leave that on the side. I would just say, Dr. Katz, having lived in Israel for 29 years with my background in television media and the print media, and television, radio, the electronic print media and public relations from New York City, that I don't know why it's the case, but Israelis, the issue of public relations is something in the culture. I don't know what it is. It doesn't register. And it's not an issue of money. They don't think like we do, like Americans, like there's a public you have to relate something to. Yeah, they have a minister, they have so many ministries. Every day there's a new
They're
ministry.
not very good.
They're
One
not good
thing
at
I will
it.
say for
I
Bibi,
don't know
I
why.
can say a lot for Bibi, but Bibi, there is no one better. Put me in touch with Bibi. I will convince and persuade that man in Hebrew that he needs to start a Hasbara department. He needs to head it up. That could be his new venture in life. He can let go of the fiction of coming back to has now passed, his ship has now sailed. But one thing that he could do is put together a Hasbara department second to none. It could be perhaps partially funded by the offshore gas fields. I could help him do that. But yes, a Hasbara department is, I had a lot of Italian friends. Italians, unlike Jews, are very fond of me. And the only thing I would say to that is forget about it, okay? The old Italian expression, forget about it. Unless the Jews come up with a strong Hasbara department, they will always be the whipping boy of the United Nations and of the nations at large in the world. And also, I want to say on a positive note to Professor Asher, if I had seen you in the cave, I would have saved you as well, because you were devilishly good looking.
Thank you.
Listen,
we agree more than we disagree. By the way, if I can be of any service, we publish a monthly bulletin. Just drop me anything, AsherJMatt@AOL.
Well, if Lowell could,
I will send an email with everyone's email address.
Right.
He also didn't tell you what my connection is with Greek Jews, which I didn't know when I first met him. We were introduced by a third party. Is that when we lived on the Lower East Side from 1988 to 1992, before going to Israel, I would go on Shabbat to the Beit Kilat Kedoshei Yanina, the Yanina synagogue.
Yeah.
It's the only one in the Western
only
Hemisphere.
one.
The Greek Jews from Yanina, and they joined with the Sephardi Jews from Monastir in Yugoslavia.
Right.
And that's where on Kiddush we had uzu and feta cheese and burekas. And our 2 girls are named, I have the certificates, are named at that synagogue. And they have one of my mother's
So we
stained
have a
glass
connection, emotional connection.
there. And as I nickname is, we have Zorba the Jew here. Zorba the Jew. Yeah.
well,
He
Lowell,
knows-
all I can say to that is it's all Greek to me.
It's all Greek.
So
And-
I will send an
And as
email
far as
to
Zorba the Jew goes, I want to tell you that one of the most wonderful souls that I have ever encountered was, strangely enough, my dog Zorba. I called him Zorba the dog.
Really?
So there is that. Although Nikos Kazantzakis, who wrote Zorba,
Yeah.
was, unless I'm mistaken, you are the acknowledged expert, Professor Asher. I think Nikos Kazantzakis had a little bit of anti-Semitic.
a little bit. He didn't like us.
The number one composer today is the 95-year-old Theodorakis, Mikis Theodorakis. He used to say, the Jews are not the problem. They're not the root of the problem. They are equivalent to the problem. They are the problem. Can you imagine? But he has mellowed in 95 years. He has mellowed somewhat. So speaking of Jewish pride, I am a walking Jewish proud Jew. So I would do whatever I can to promote that your dream and your mission.
Dr. Katz, since we're coming to the end of our time period and Les is not here to conclude the program, could you make a concluding statement about Jewish identity? And then I'll make my concluding, thank everyone for listening remarks.
Well, I will be brief and concise, but ultimately, the issue of Jewish identity is your own personal future and who you are and who you wish to be, what your life is about. But yes, the nation state, the Jewish state of Israel will survive, will thrive. But the question is, will you personally thrive? And I would submit to you that by an understanding of history, by appreciating accomplishments, by understanding the miracle of it all, then you will prosper as an individual human being. And after all is said and done, we're all collections of self-interests and whatnot. And in so doing, then you transmit that to the next generation and the generation thereafter. And it is a gift to give them the concept, the beauty of having a strong identity, whether it be Jewish or otherwise, as long as that identity is not at the expense of someone else. Whenever I was, exhibited pride in Jewish accomplishment, it was never at the expense of, look what we did and everybody else is nothing. No, you have to respect yourself, and then you have an open mind to be able to see the accomplishments of other people's. And that is true tolerance, and that is true liberalism, and that is a true strong identity. Thank you.
Beautiful.
So we want to thank, on behalf of Dr. Glassman and myself, we want to thank Dr. Katz for speaking to us this evening, and Professor Asher Matathias Zorba the Jew for joining us this evening, as he does for most of our programs when he's available, as well as hosting his monthly Greek Jewry Through the Ages seminar. We want to thank our viewers and listeners wherever you may be. Again, today is Tuesday, June 15, 2021 in the Gregorian calendar. And now that it's the nighttime here, it is the 6th of Tammuz 5781 in the Hebrew Israelite calendar. It's still the beginning of the month, so we wish you a Chodesh Tov from Jerusalem, Israel, and good night to everybody. Laila Tov.
Toda rabba, ani marich et ze.
Thank you.